Good morning. My name is Carl LeVan. I'm a professor in the School of International Service at American University. The School of International Service was founded in the 1950s by President Eisenhower, making it something of a unique school for the study of international affairs and politics. And President Eisenhower chartered us as a school that would prepare diplomats to, as he described it, wage peace. And so this is what we have been doing as students, as members of a global community, and as scholars for 60 years now. And we're very pleased to have several colleagues and myself involved in this event, discussing the incident last week with Salman Rushdie and its broader implications for freedom of expression and for creative processes in America and beyond. I'm going to take a moment to introduce the speakers and to thank some people who've been involved and to describe what I, as a witness, saw last Friday at the Chautauqua Institution where Salman Rushdie was attacked. And we're just today starting to learn a little bit more about his attacker. So joining me for the conversation today is my colleague, Ambassador Professor Akbar Ahmed, who is the Ibn Khaldun Chair of Islamic Studies in the School of International Service here at American University. And he's also a Woodrow Wilson Center Global Fellow. And he's been a great colleague in my program, Comparative and Regional Studies, a really cutting-edge master's degree program, and is the author of many, many books. The one that is perhaps most relevant for today's discussion is his book on Postmodernism and Islam, which discusses the Rushdie affair in some detail. He's also the author of several other books that may be relevant for today's discussion, including Journey into Europe and Journey into America, two books based on extensive field research, which explore some of the challenges of Muslims living within multicultural societies in the Western world. And so I really commend those two books to those of you who may be interested in some of those broader issues of multiculturalism, religious identity, and assimilation. We're also joined by Nadine Farid Johnson, the managing director of PEN America in Washington, and the director of the Free Expression Programs. For those of you who may not be familiar with PEN, it's an extremely important human rights organization devoted to human rights of writers and those engaged in the creative process. So those of you interested in more information, please check them out at pen.org. Nadine also previously served as the executive director of the ACLU in Kentucky and also did a stint as an American diplomat. So we're going to start with a few pictures, just giving you some visuals for what I witnessed last Friday at the Chautauqua Institution in New York State, Western New York State. If the staff could bring up those images right now, that would be helpful. And I'll also say a thing or two about the Chautauqua Institution itself. So this was last Friday. So I took this picture just a few seconds after the attacker rushed onto the stage. And so as you can see, I was fairly close to the front. The 10:45 lecture at Chautauqua is always the biggest event of the day. And we knew that there was going to be a lot of excitement and attention and interest in Rushdie's speech. So we got there a little bit early. And the gentleman on the right was just starting to go through the program and describe relevant events and announcements for the day when the attacker rushed on stage. You can see how quickly the police, the New York State Police, responded, as well as a number of members of the audience who rushed on stage, including at least one doctor. And I just want to say, as a testament to the Chautauqua Institution, that that's the kind of community that spends time there. These are people who are deeply compassionate, deeply caring, and deeply celebrate intellectual diversity and curiosity. And so those are some of the things we'll talk about today, and I want to emphasize in the background about the Chautauqua institution. Next slide, please. This was a picture of the Chautauqua Daily, which is a newspaper produced on the grounds. The grounds are about 750 acres, and Chautauqua was the birthplace of the Chautauqua movement nearly 150 years ago for lifelong learning. There was a movement that began in Christian religious circles that embraced the idea that many people wanted to continue learning and discussing ideas after secondary education or after college. And so very quickly, those ideas expanded to include topics beyond religion. But it's a place where every day there are people who are debating politics, debating religion, and enjoying poetry and music. It is a really special place. And so I think it was appropriate to bring somebody like Rushdie. And as you can see here, he intended to talk a little bit about the importance of protecting persecuted writers. Next slide, please. These are some pictures from the afternoon of the attack. Next slide. That's a picture of the amphitheater, or the AMP as we call it. And this is the other side of the AMP. So this is the police presence in the hours immediately after the attack. Next slide. And I took this picture to give you another visual for the AMP. I took this picture the night before, sitting in the choir loft. So this is a rear view of the stage where the attack took place. And one thing I want you to absorb about this picture also, as I've discussed diversity and curiosity at Chautauqua, is that this is a place where 8-year-olds and 80-year-olds might gather for a Tchaikovsky concert, or they might gather for a lecture about housing rights in Buffalo. And so it's a really interesting and unique place that plays an important part, I think, in advancing a grand American intellectual tradition. Next slide, please. And then lastly, I just want to close with this one. Some years ago, my friend and colleague, Ambassador Ahmed, came to speak at Chautauqua in the Hall of Philosophy, which is also where the vigil on Friday night was held for Salman Rushdie. And he spoke about his research for the books that I mentioned, Journey into Europe and Journey into America. This is Palestine Park, which is a model of Palestine built to scale. And several times a week, there are tours of Palestine explaining its place in the Bible and in the broader Christian and Abrahamic traditions. So with that, I want to turn it over to my co-panelist, Nadine Farid Johnson, with a question or two. And one question is, just how common are these kinds of attacks against writers and authors around the world? And obviously, this particular attack was motivated out of religious concerns or religious critiques, but what other kinds of issues inspire this kinds of intolerance and anger? Thank you, Nadine.
Thank you so much, Carl. Thank you to you and to Ambassador Ahmed and to AU for hosting. I'm really chagrined at the circumstances that preceded this event, but I am glad that we are here to talk about the critical issue of writing, of free expression, and of human rights. As you noted, PEN America is an organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to protect free expression. And I thought I'd talk a little bit about our relationship with Salman and as a preface to answering your questions. There are really few people whose work and lives have exemplified why we do what we do, like Salman Rushdie. The fatwa and his fierce resistance to it mobilized so many around PEN America's mission. It was truly a defining moment for the organization. We advocated heavily for him, and it really cemented our connection. And then he became president of PEN America in 2004. He led the organization through the post 9/11 years that saw new threats to free expression in the US, that put up new barriers between countries and people. And then he co-founded the PEN World Voices Festival. It's the largest international literary festival in the US. And his intent in doing so was safeguarding and broadening the channels of dialogue and cultural exchange between the United States and the world, which is still the festival's mission. And as we know, is really all too needed still. Salman Rushdie's experience embodies everything that we fight for at PEN America: the freedom to write, to think, to speak freely, to inspire, and to challenge without fear. That is why we work to defend writers under threat around the world. And his experience, as you know, has made him a dauntless advocate. As you mentioned, he was there to discuss with Henry Reese at the City of Asylum how to protect persecuted writers. And in fact, the morning of the attack, he was emailing with our CEO, Suzanne Nossel, to see how he could support Ukrainian writers. So truly part and parcel of his persona and his character. So how do these threats evolve, and where are they coming from? I will say we are absolutely in an alarming moment for free expression globally. We have had horrifying reversals of progress from Myanmar to Afghanistan, India, Hungary, Tunisia, Brazil, many others. We're seeing a significant tightening of space in places like Russia, China, Egypt. People don't often think about writers and artists in the same way they do maybe other human rights defenders. But in places like Myanmar, in Belarus, around the world, writers and artists have been at the forefront in movements for democracy and resistance to authoritarianism. And they use their art as a means of resistance, and that makes them a target. So that's one reason we're seeing so much of this, is that these individuals, these groups are targeted because they are resisting authoritarianism. In Myanmar, we saw widespread and sustained civil disobedience, including the creative resistance of writers and artists following the coup. And as we know now, the junta responded by executing 2 people for the first time in over 2 decades because of their art, which was part of their resistance. Belarusians have continued their resistance against a president holding on to power despite an election he seemed to think he could steal without a fight. And today, of course, Putin must not only contend with the fierce resistance of Ukrainian people, but also Russians inside the country and around the world who persist in speaking the truth. So where is this happening? Savannah has a chart I can share with you. Every year we publish at PEN America the Freedom to Write Index. It's a count of the writers and journalists who are held behind bars around the world during the previous year. In 2021, we documented at least 277 writers, academics, public intellectuals who are unjustly detained or imprisoned in connection with their writing. That's a jump from prior years. And you can see here that with the blue arrow, that's pointing to Iran. Iran is one of the countries that is most guilty of imprisoning its writers. But it's not just the individuals who are held in detention or in long-term imprisonment in their home countries. It's also those who are exiled. And that's where the numbers get a little bit fuzzy. We know that the long arm of authoritarianism, which reaches across borders to intimidate and harm writers in exile in democratic countries, is a real and present threat. We've seen it with Jamal Khashoggi. We've seen it with Hong Kong booksellers who were abducted by China. We've seen it in the case of Iran. Another case, one example of an Iranian person who is in exile and still targeted is Masih Alinejad. She was the target of an alleged Tehran-backed kidnapping plot last year. The US charged 4 Iranians suspected of being intelligence officers with plotting to abduct her. A couple of weeks ago, a man with a loaded AK-47 rifle was on her doorstep. And right now there are dozens, one source told me countless numbers of Iranian writers, journalists, poets, and others who are in exile and under threat due to their writing. So why does this happen? There's a reason that writers are targeted by authoritarians and extremists the world over, and that's because stories are powerful. Stories can offer people a vision of a different world. They remind people that they themselves have the power to imagine something different and to make it real. And that's viewed as a threat by those who want to keep people in the cage of their own tyranny. And it's also viewed as a threat by those who follow them, because it's a threat to their worldview, it's a threat to their belief system, and it is undermining to them. So that's what we see happening, is that people are, even though they are in exile, away from their homelands, the threat does not actually leave them, as unfortunately we've seen in the case of Salman.
Yeah, thank you for those details. And Freedom House, the human rights organization based in Washington, D.C., just a few weeks ago released a report documenting cases of extraterritorial repression and the growing number of countries that do engage in human rights violations outside of their own borders. And so this is a really different shift in the way we think about democratization and how scholars like myself explore the domestic and international dimensions of democracy and human rights. So next, I think we'd like to hear from my distinguished colleague, Ambassador Ahmed. And how do you reflect upon this event and its broader implications?
Thank you, Carl. Thank you, Nadine. It's a great honor to be on a panel with such distinguished colleagues and backed by American University's A team, Kate, Kay, and Savannah. For me, Carl, this whole episode goes back to the time Salman wrote the book. And within a few months, it had exploded. So I was at Cambridge University then, I just arrived. And by 1990, Bradford had exploded. And it's important to put this in a historical context, without which we really do not understand what Salman went through, and really, to put on record, his courage and his, people don't understand what he went through and how he stuck to his guns and survived. So at the height of this crisis, there were deaths in Iran, there were deaths in Pakistan, and a red line had been drawn by the Muslim leadership, Muslims on this side and people who approved of Salman on that side. So Muslims who even talked of Salman, for example, on television, sometimes I would say Salman Rushdie, they would criticize me. They would say, why are you taking his name? It had become so toxic. So in the middle of all this, Salman Rushdie rang me. I was at Cambridge and he rang me several times. And he said, I've read your book, Discovering Islam. There's an early book. And he said, I would like you to represent me or talk about me, try to build bridges, close the gap with the Muslim world, especially the leadership. Now, I was very reluctant because I knew how dangerous this was. I knew immediately some Muslim extremists would attack me. I had also been a writer, I'd been a filmmaker, and I'd had a lot of this kind of attention, violent, negative attention. So I knew how sensitive it was. But I agreed because I felt if I could play a role in bridge building, I'd do it. So eventually we met after a complicated schedule worked out by the Secret Service, and we spent a few hours together. And I wrote up all that in a major article in The Guardian, 5,000 words, January 91, well worth looking at because that reflects a very different side of Salman Rushdie. He is very keen to build bridges. He gives some very practical, sensible suggestions how he would build these bridges. It's a great lesson in how a writer, and in my mind, a writer who is very sensitive to issues of immigration, of racism, of these postmodernist issues that are confronting, especially immigrants. That didn't work out in the end. We tried on both sides. It didn't quite work out. The Muslim leadership had several sessions with me, and it was a bit like the Inquisition in Spain half a millennium ago. Literally, they would grill me, they would talk to me. Why was I even doing this? Why would even I want to talk to him? One of them even said, you were in a room with him alone, why didn't you stab him? It was that height of unrealism. But over time, this sort of fizzled out and nothing happened. And we all were lulled into believing that things had returned to normal. Now, this is a very dangerous phase because you see clearly in Chautauqua, and I'm sorry my distinguished friend Carl had to see this. I know how sensitive he is, and this will have an impact, a traumatic impact on him. But this clearly tells us that a new phase has begun in the saga of Salman Rushdie. So that this extraordinary writer, this extraordinary, I would even say, a genius, is now going to once again face the unknown assailant at a place where no one can predict. Because, and I need our viewers to understand what is motivating Muslims. I know Nadine has talked about targets and authoritarianism and dictatorship and so on. But for the vast majority of Muslims, I will say this on record, the vast majority want to get on with their lives, want to look ahead and put this in the past. The vast majority, however, do not like the satanic verses, and they will not like it simply because of the content. So here you have a kind of predicament, a dilemma. So while they would like to move ahead, they still have the book, and how do you deal with it? And Salman Rushdie gives the answer in his conversation with me. So we have to work out a system where we preserve and maintain, and I'm 100% behind the idea of never inflicting any kind of violence on any author or writer because he or she's writing something, or in any case, any kind of violence. I'm absolutely clear. I've been writing about it. I've been sticking my neck out and at times been a target. At the same time, I'm also very clear in pointing out that in traditional societies, I need everyone to understand this clearly. We're in America. It's fine. It's a very different kind of society. Nadine has to do what she has to do. She's been a diplomat. But go to Burma and try to abuse and say things about Lord Buddha, or go to India and say some nasty things about Lord Rama, and you will see the reaction. It will be exactly as the Muslims reacted to their perception of their holy prophet and his family being attacked. Rightly or wrongly, I'm just telling you as an anthropologist what would happen in that society. So we have to find a way out of this. If we don't, you're seeing the string of deaths, Japan, Denmark, UK, and this will go on. I mean, even the fact that we're having a conversation immediately will mark me in the minds of some extremists. At the same time, the silver lining to me is that the government of Iran has not been involved. In the past, they would always make a statement. They would even crow if something happened to discomfort Salman. So this is a positive sign. At the same time, the ignorance of this young man about Salman Rushdie's book, very, very few Muslims have even read the book, or his motivation, the lack of clarity about his motivation, indicates to me, and I have been a law and order man in the field, indicates to me that we have to be very, very careful as of now into this next chapter of the story of Salman. I'd be happy to answer any other questions that you may have. I do want to end with one point, that while we are here and we are strongly condemning any suggestion or hint at violence of any kind, rightly so. And Muslims living here, and this is another phenomena, millions of Muslims migrating to the West, whether here or in the UK, they must respect the law of the land. And the law of the land, freedom of expression, freedom of writing, as Carl has hinted in his title, the freedom to write, this must be maintained. This is one of the basic pillars of these Western societies, which we admire and we value. But also remember that other countries have their own laws. For example, in Pakistan, I'm sure in Iran, Nadine will confirm this, or in Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan, they have different laws. In Pakistan, they have laws called the Blasphemy Law. So anyone seen to be blaspheming against the Prophet or his family is then to be subjected to death. That's how serious it is. And very often, innocent people are entangled in that law. Innocent people, and I've done research on this. I wrote an article in the Washington Post on this. And once they get caught up, the police come in, the judiciary comes in, and no one wants to touch the case. So we have to be very sensitive about putting people in danger by not understanding the context of some of these incidents. And those are innocent people. Very often in Pakistan, Christian people will get caught up. You may have heard about the famous Christian girl who was accused of blasphemy, put in death row, and after a long, long time, she was released. She came out, but that sword hangs over people, and this blasphemy law can become very deadly for people who may or may not be seen as insulting or blaspheming against the Prophet. So we need to keep that factor in mind.
Thank you for that background and that broader analysis, Ambassador Ahmed. It's always a pleasure to hear from you, and I've really enjoyed dialoguing with you over the years in comparative and regional studies and beyond.
Carl, we must get back to Chautauqua. We must show them. We must rally around. You and I are both great admirers of Chautauqua. That, to me, is quintessential American culture. This broad, generous, really gathering of some of the best people in the world they invite to talk. So I'm really, like you, profoundly upset and shocked, and I hope it does not dampen Chautauqua. They must, of course, they must have better security of people like Rushdie. Luckily, you and I, Carla, reasonably less known, so no one's going to protect us. But it's very important that someone like Rushdie should have that level of security. That I would say that's common sense.
Yeah, there's certainly been some debate around the level of security that Chautauqua offered. And Michael Hill, the president, issued, I think, a fairly bold statement that really tried to reflect the values of Chautauqua. And I think what they're trying to do is to say, if we're going to embrace intellectual diversity, if we're going to invite a range of views, and just as another example of that, this is the place where I heard the evangelical preacher, Richard Land, explain how Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11. And so, they, even though it is a fairly liberal community, they will invite conservatives there in the interest of intellectual diversity. And they will have civilized, engaging, mutually beneficial and enlightening conversations. But anyway, so Michael Hill, and the Chautauqua Institution thus far has said that they do not plan to make significant changes to their security, that they, may not impose metal detectors and so forth, because in order to have that open exchange of ideas, there needs to be a level of physical openness and trust. And so we've talked a little bit about tolerance of ideas and intolerance of ideas. And I think one of my reflections upon this terrible incident on Friday is that trust is an important precursor for that sort of tolerance. And as we think about polarization in America, all these things work together somehow. So I don't know if you wanted to respond to that, particularly in light of, the post 9/11 world, where the immediate response was to harden the target, meaning to make it more difficult for a target to be attacked. And Chautauqua is largely rejecting that strategy.
Carl, I agree, because the charm of Chautauqua is precisely that open, the open spaces, the relaxed. I mean, I've been there several times, as you know, and I don't think they even have a lock on the door. So, it's that open, and that's wonderful. That's beautiful. At the same time, we must be aware we are living in a time of great tension, not just America, but globally. We are living in a very strange phase of, and ignore the climate change and the virus and the pandemic. We're living in that time, at the period of history. And what worries me as a Muslim is that this may provoke a backlash, as it did in the past, against Muslims, and this may then feed into Islamophobia, the hatred or the antagonism towards Muslim, so that a lot of people would in fact be siding with Rushdie, and Nadine may like to comment on this, simply to use that as something to bash the Muslims. So Muslims who may have nothing to do with this, and remember, Muslims are almost 2 billion people, and they're not a monolith, and a lot of Muslims would completely disapprove of this kind of violence, but they would all be categorized then as Muslim or Muslim. So the result is that there is a danger of violence on the other side. So we need to be very careful. Having played the role of a bridge builder in the past with Salman Rushdie, I'm aware how difficult this balancing act is, to try to keep the dialogue going and try to maintain a level of sanity and compassion with pressure from both sides. So we need to remember that and hold on to that idea.
Thank you. I hope we can return maybe a little bit later to the question about tolerance, intolerance, and intellectual diversity. I want to turn to a question from the audience, which may be best directed at you, Nadine. And there's a question coming about the suppression against Palestinian journalists in particular. I think that raises broader questions in two ways. One about the suppression of journalists by governments around the world. I've certainly seen this sort of trouble in my research on Nigeria. And so I'm wondering if you could, if not comment on that specifically, perhaps comment on how repression against people engaged in fiction might differ a little bit from repression against people who are perhaps reporting on corruption or reporting on facts and misdeeds and human rights violations by the government. That these are, in other words, one type of person who is suffering repression these days is engaged in a creative process of imagination, while another type of individual, a journalist, perhaps is trying to report the facts and is therefore under threat. How are those phenomena different?
It's a really interesting question. In fact, because what we've seen is that while journalists are, as you know, targeted for reporting on corruption, for unveiling the truth as to what is happening kind of behind the scenes within government, fiction writers are often seen as writing about what's happening, but in a way that is cloaked in the kind of in the sheen of fiction. And so they are seen as just as much of a threat, because you will see examples. This happened actually in Uganda recently, where the president saw a book as actually referencing him and his government, when in fact it was a work of fiction. And so the idea is, I can help you now.
Give me a minute.
What was
the
that?
idea is.
Sorry.
The idea is that the the individuals who are authoritarian in their actions and their deeds in terms of running a government, or authoritarian minded, are in fact concerned about this, and they want to quash any modicum of dissent, whether it is in the vein of fiction or under the and within the realms of journalism.
And an organization, I think, to watch those threats against journalists, of course, is Committee to Protect Journalism.
Absolutely.
And it raises another question, though, which I think is a good prompt for Akbar, which is, in my research the last couple of years, I've been exploring post-truth politics in America. And I apologize, by the way, for that brief interruption. And one of the things that many writers have talked about with regard to the rise of post-truth politics and the difficulty of agreeing on what constitutes the truth in the United States involves influences from the humanities and postmodernism in particular. And so Ambassador Ahmed is someone who has written about postmodernism and the engagement of those ideas with Islam. Could you talk a little bit about some of that connection there? So just to maybe make a little more concrete what I have in mind, Michiko Kakutani, the literary critic, said it was all fun and games to engage these ideas of postmodernism when we were talking about novels, but once it spilled over into a discussion of facts and actual politics and policy, it got us into trouble. So what did you come to understand about the relationship between this broader trend of postmodernism and relation with contemporary Islam?
Carl, a very important question. I teach Islam on campus. I always have full classes, wonderful students, enthusiastic, wanting to understand Islam. A lot of them have been seeing negative images of Islam, so they're keen to find out the truth. So I stick to the basic principle that was enunciated by Socrates, which is stick to facts, very important. Question, let them question things, present the facts so that they come to their own conclusions. Now, I find that we are, again, going back to the period we're living in, we are living in times, and we mustn't shy away from this, where people here in the West or in the East or wherever have some very, very limited ideas about the other. Here are some examples. A poll in the United Kingdom, Great Britain, a recent poll established that almost 30% of very bright students in England thought that Winston Churchill was a fictitious character, and that Sherlock Holmes and Eleanor Rigby were actual historical characters. And 40% surveyed, and this is a huge poll in Britain, thought that the American Civil War was won by Denzel Washington. Now, I could give you similar examples from America and even similar examples from the Muslim world. So our task, my task certainly as a teacher, is to teach, to present facts, to continue to understand the context of these youngsters. Now, in the midst of this, we have Nadine's problem, writers and authors, especially novelists, because novelists by definition must write novels. That is, they must fall back on their imagination. And Rushdie is one of the pioneers of this magical realism, certainly in South Asia. And of course, he started a trend. So he's mixing up history and folklore and ordinary conversations and abuse and all kinds of things. So if you're not very much aware of the context of what is happening, I can understand how it would agitate, it may annoy, it may even create a sense of anger, and that is what you're seeing. So for us, Carl, certainly for me as a teacher, I take it very seriously. It's almost a sacred trust. We have to help these youngsters open their minds, let them have access to not only the information for that particular course, but the broader world that they're living in. Because without that, they will not have the shell or the shield to protect themselves once they go into the world. And remember, these kids have to grow up, and some of them are going to go to the diplomatic field like Nadine, some will be in the State Department, some will join, some of my students have joined the FBI, some are journalists, and they really need this understanding. More than that, they need the method of thinking. How do they cope with a world which is very different from what they were brought up to believe in, and how do they then adjust their ideas with the world outside?
And this is certainly one of the great obligations and challenges of higher education, indeed, right now, and something that I think American University is really doing its best to tackle. And thank you for mentioning Rushdie's magical realism. A few years ago, I read 2 years, 8 months, and 28 nights, and I just immediately compared to Gabriel Garcia Marquez.
Yes.
And I found it challenging and enjoyable, and I felt like I was learning about a different part of the world. So I just want to remind members of the audience that you can use the Q&A function to pose a question. I think we're moving towards a part of the program where we would welcome more questions from the audience. And I'm happy to probe Professor Akbar Ahmed a little bit further, but Nadine, is there anything that you want to comment on based on what he just said?
Yes, actually, the comment about people needing to adjust to the world outside of what their experience has been, I think, is a really critical one. And it is, I think, at the heart of defending freedom of expression and the freedom to write. We have to defend the right of writers and of others to take risks and to be courageous in their writing, and to be honest in their writing, and to do so without fear. I think that we have a situation now where there's a potential, a tendency to wish to try to second guess or anticipate what might be offensive and to kind of sidestep the landmines, if you will. And that honestly comes down to a denial of the right to express. Because the question is always going to be one of who decides what will be offensive. If something offensive to me, can I prevent you from reading it? I think from our perspective and from the perspective of the baseline right, which is such a fundamental right of free expression, not only in the US, but around the world, there needs to be a recognition that you have the right to question, to critique, to argue, but it should never leach over into violence, and it should never leach over into silencing.
Nadine, I had a very bright young student in my class, The World of Islam, and this was just when the Iraq war began. And he was then sent to Iraq, just like that. And I was thinking to myself, I said, my God, he suddenly landed in the middle of some Iraqi town, not even Baghdad. And someone shoots at him from a mosque, and he's got to decide, do I shoot back? Do I insult Islam by shooting at a mosque? Do I ignore this and get killed? What do I do? Do I even know what a Shia is, what a Sunni is? And I thought that was very, very unfair. So I spent a lot of time, and I was again then invited to the Pentagon and various units to talk about Islam, so they have a basic understanding of the world and how this massive world global religion with which they're engaged in a positive way and a negative way, but some understanding of it. The basic understanding, Shia and Sunni. They had no understanding, as you know, when it all began. Most Americans thought every Muslim was an Arab. They would tell me this, are you an Arab? And I would say, no, I'm not an Arab. I'm not even an Arab. So, it was that level. And that is why I think there's so much obligation and responsibility on the shoulders of the teacher, whether it's the professor or the high school teacher. It's a huge responsibility. And too little, I'm sorry to say, too little is taught in these earlier educational institutions about the world. So by the time they come to us, they really haven't been informed.
I think that's a really good point. I think Nadine is raising a slightly different question, though, which is, has it become risky to be curious about other cultures in higher education? I think there's been a really productive, important social justice shift in the last couple of years, raising questions about authenticity and who has the right to speak for whom, and how should different identities and communities be represented. And this has been a really important step forward, I think, in the way that we think about authenticity and about the rights of communities that have been marginalized. But I've been following the work, for example, of Zadie Smith, and a few years ago, she had an essay where she essentially said, if I can't write about a Jewish person in Brooklyn as one of my characters in a fictional story, then literature is dead. And, this is not, I think, just a question of literature. I think it raises broader questions about how we come to know other communities, especially when books are works of historical fiction or when they have, cultural references that are familiar. When my students get ready to go study overseas, they often come to my office hours and say, what should I do to prepare? And I say, find the most famous one or two authors from that country and read them. because those will be the phrases that you hear and the food that you will eat. And it'll give you a different reference point for understanding the places that they're talking about and the family relations that they describe and the tensions between citizens and the government and so forth. So, how do we get to a place where writers are safe and where it's okay to be curious and maybe clumsy once in a while as a student?
Well, Carl, I always look back on history. History is a great teacher. And I do want to point out to our viewers that the Muslim world has been the victim of their great libraries. The Muslims are great bibliophiles, great authors, have been burnt and destroyed. You know, the first sack of Baghdad by the Mongols, thousands of books were destroyed. Andalusia, when finally the Muslims and the Jews were expelled, hundreds of thousands of libraries and books destroyed. Sarajevo in the 1990s. So Muslims have faced this. Now, I would also say, if you look at history, Muslims have been writers and scholars and philosophers, and very often challenging authority. Nadine, this is where the author or the writer challenges authority. And sometimes they've been in trouble and sometimes they've had to run. I hold the chair, which is named after Ibn Khaldun, one of the greatest historians of the world ever, anywhere. And he had to run. Literally, he was in Spain, then he had to cross over into what is now Morocco, over North Africa, and then end up in Egypt, one step ahead, as it were, of the assassin's blade. So Muslims have been writing critical stuff, but they've had to do it in spite of the dangers. And I think that is the cross, to use a metaphor from Christianity, that every writer must bear, because you cannot separate the two. You cannot say, here's a safe space for you to write, because then that writer is not making the impact or not doing what he should be doing, which is also pointing out the danger areas. I told you early on that I was also subject to some criticism, which was bordering on violence. 500 people outside my hotel room chanting and yelling against me. And that only happened because I was prepared to look at traditional images or traditional ideas and challenge them. And it was my duty as a scholar, if I had integrity, to do that. And I believed I did. So I did it. And those are the consequences that you face. I mean, so far I haven't been physically attacked. I've been shot at, and 2 or 3 times in the tribal areas. I've escaped so far. But this is what we must all of us participating in this very important session, must be aware of, that we are very privileged to be in the United States. And some of the recent debates I'm hearing about freedom and so on worry me a lot, because we seem to be heading in a very different and dangerous direction. And I'm sure Nadine may want to comment on this, but if you remove this sense of tolerance and ease with which you can communicate in the United States, which is what makes the United States, we are not moving ahead, we are moving backward.
Nadine Farid Johnson from Penn, do you want to comment?
Yes, Carl, thank you. I think the ambassador is exactly right. Actually, Carl, to your point, you mentioned Zadie Smith and her statement about being able to write about different characters. And actually, Henry Louis Gates Jr. Invoked Wole Soyinka, who I know you know well from your work on Nigeria, at a PEN America Gala last year, and then this actually was put into a New York Times essay. And he said, any teacher, any student, any reader, any writer, sufficiently attentive and motivated, must be able to engage freely with subjects of their choice. That is not only the essence of learning, it's the essence of being human. And I think the other part of that is that that's the essence of a democracy. We are certainly seeing an increased inclination from all ends of the spectrum to violate the precepts of free expression. And we have to foster a culture of freedom of expression in order to ensure the health of our democracy. It's absolutely critical. It's not just government and legal threats. It's what we are doing part and parcel day to day to be sure to promote those principles.
And I think back upon some of the great American intellectuals who were critics of American imperialism, like Mark Twain. I mean, what would American literature be without Mark Twain and his, bold criticism of the wars overseas, or Henry David Thoreau and his criticism of the invasion of Mexico. And in Africa, I want to go back to a point you said earlier about how novelists have a different way of posing a threat or critiquing governments. One of my favorite examples was Ngugi's book, Wizard of the Crow, where he, truly mocks the dictator so effectively over a couple hundred pages. And it's this sort of caricature of an authoritarian ruler. And my friend Ebenezer Obadari has written about this as infrapolitics, where sometimes within popular culture, there are jokes which are actually subversive attacks on government incompetence or corruption. And so it's a totally different way of accessing people's imaginations, so that they're engaged in politics and they're building relationships with each other. But I think part of me wants to not presume that Salman Rushdie, is always motivated by those questions. I mean, Ambassador Ahmed may be in a better position to comment on this, because of his interactions with Rushdie, but I think he really just has a deeply engaged imagination and a creative force within him, and he uses that in different ways. And so,
well, Carl, what I found fascinating was that in South Asia, where Rushdie is really, a lot of his work is based in that context. In South Asia, there's a very popular folk songs, folk music called the Qawwali. And it's a kind of synthesis of Hinduism and Muslimism, devotional songs. And the paradox is that those songs are really praising the Prophet and the family of the Prophet, and indirectly then criticizing the rulers. So if they're praising the Prophet for his honesty, or the rulers for their compassion towards ordinary people, they're in fact saying that our present rulers, a tyrant and he doesn't care for the people. And this is what I think is the great paradox of this whole Rushdie saga, if you like, that Rushdie, by taking the Prophet's family and being seen to be criticizing that, he has removed the strongest plank that he had, which he could have used to make the points he wants to make, which is critiquing and criticizing Muslim society. And I really feel that had given him, had he continued in that mode that we had talked about, something very strong to talk with and to the Muslim world and its leadership. Because right now that channel has been broken and there's no dialogue and no conversation.
So I want to ask a different kind of question. And again, to encourage members of the audience to drop a question into the Q&A function. And that is, the conversation has shifted in the last couple of days, I think. And now we're starting to debate the implications of the attack for things that perhaps have nothing to do with it, such as the Iran nuclear deal, which the Biden administration had almost simultaneously made great progress on. And of course, the Trump administration abandoned this agreement in 2018. Should we read, metaphorical importance, or should we allow this event to punctuate these broader issues, which are so important for global peace?
I think, Carl, we have to be very, very clear. We have to be steady. We have to remember that from the American point of view, and this American foreign policy, which must be guided and informed by this vision, is the fact that America must guard its own position, promote its own position. And in order to do that, it must deal with as it sees it, the problem countries. And Iran is, for America, a problem country. It must resolve that problem. Now, bringing in Rushdie is simply going to complicate it. It's not going to help America's position. And also keep in mind that because Rushdie's position was initially, the fatwa came from Iran, and Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, is a Shia cleric. There is a slight nuance here, distinction between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, between the Arab position and the Iranian position, that we've got to keep that in mind. So rather than antagonize the Muslim world, we need to keep a focus on the assailant. Someone has attacked Rushdie, that the law and order process should begin and he should be impugned and punished and so on. But this should have nothing to do with greater policy, foreign policy, that America must pursue in its own interest and in a wise and sensible way. Again, it's a dangerous world. You have China there. America is also entangled with that. You have Russia in Ukraine. You have other adventures in the pipeline, which America will have to face. And again, America needs to be wise and compassionate and stick to that. Be very, very steady. It's a choppy waters. In choppy waters, you simply hold firm.
I think that's exactly right. The United States can and must do both. It can and must hold human rights out at the forefront of its foreign policy and continue in its attempts to continue to ensure national security. It has to be able to hold both of those things, and to ensure that freedom of expression, among other human rights, continues to be protected.
Exactly, Nadine, and I think the greatest gift that we can give to the world today, and let's be very frank, very few countries have this kind of organization where you're fighting for the rights of other people without being bribed or without being the niece of the minister or whatever, which is how it happens in many parts of the world. So if that is the case, that is your biggest asset. It's not the bombs and the missiles and the drones. It is your ideas. And I feel sometimes we don't fully understand the importance of the kind of work that you are doing. I really feel that. So Carl, thank you so much for giving us this chance.
Yeah, thank you. And so we have one or two more questions coming in from the audience, and I want to make sure that we end on time and that I also take a moment to thank the many staff across American University who were involved in making this event a success. In particular, I'm really excited about the involvement of the American University Library. Strangely enough, across the United States, the last few years, libraries have become the front line of defense for the First Amendment in making sure that a range of books are on the shelves to respond to the interests and needs and curiosities of young people in particular. So one question, which I think might be a big one, asks how millennials and younger generations turning to social media and other forms of information, how that has shortened their attention spans and therefore impacted their understanding of free expression and their experience with learning. I mean, this is certainly something that I experience in the classroom constantly. I've been very interested in the research by psychologists on this. As a practical matter, I strongly encourage my students to buy the paper books or borrow the paper books, simply because you won't get as distracted. Matthew Crawford, interestingly, has written about this. He's a philosopher, and he's written about this as a cultural problem rather than one that is primarily a technological problem. Although, personally, I'm a great fan of the work of the Center for Humane Technology, which is has a great podcast and has explored in its podcast how app developers have embrace strategies such as recruiting people who design gambling machines in order to design apps on your phone, that they literally have psychologists and engineers who are trying to bring you back to the phone, to open it up as much as possible, to notify you as much as possible, to distract you as much as possible. And psychologists will tell you that pulling you away and interrupting you just makes it more difficult to arrive at analytical understanding, to arrive at depth, and to create in an original way. And this is not simply an abstract question. Nadine Johnson and I yesterday were talking about how the 9/11 Commission, after the horrific attacks on the Twin Towers and the Pentagon and Flight 93, how the 9/11 Commission said it was a failure of imagination. So part of the response was for the CIA to then go and talk to novelists about how to anticipate possible threats. But again, I want to give you the opportunity to respond to this question about attention spans and understanding free expression.
It's a really interesting and thoughtful question. So I think two angles here. One is that there's actually an interview with the assailant in the New York Post this morning, where he talks about the fact that he hasn't read the Satanic Verses. And I think that's emblematic of a lot of what we're seeing is that people are exposed to things in short tidbits. We live in kind of an 8-second soundbite world or in a 280 character world. And the misinformation that is coming at people is doing so at an incredibly rapid rate. So there are really kind of two angles here. One is, as Carl notes, pick up the paper book. I tell my kids that all the time. If you're going to read, you're going to read the actual paper book. And the other is to be an informed purveyor and consumer of information. Understand what it is that you're reading. Have the principles of media literacy at your fingertips, because that, I think, will help people recognize what it is that they're reading in terms of what is true and what is not, and then also hopefully spur that curiosity that can then lead someone to engage more with the literature and broaden their understanding of history, as the ambassador notes, and of broader context. The context is so key. If we don't have an understanding as to the nuances of different religions, different identities, different cultures, we really do ourselves a disservice.
And Nadine, what I find very helpful for the students is from time to time to invite someone representing that particular subject. For example, I have a class called Judaism and Islam. So I'll have a friend of mine, a rabbi or some Jewish scholar coming and speaking from the Jewish perspective. It's always fascinating. Or someone coming from an embassy talking about US relations with, say, a Muslim country. Or a friend of mine who was in the American military, who was in Afghanistan, sharing his experiences. Now, for students to be actually in a room for an hour and a half with someone like that, as it was straight horse's mouth, giving them the kind of information they may not get fully in a book. It makes a lot of difference. And then they have questions afterwards when we talk, and they're able to then clarify the ideas, and that remains in their mind, I find. Because remember, they're competing with so many images in the world, and changing images and striking images and different opinions, that I don't blame students and young people in this generation, that they are very often not sure of how to proceed.
The cognitive burden of evaluating all these different sources when you do rely on social media is really quite tremendous. And I think part of our task as educators is to simplify that process of making decisions and to help establish reliable guides for evaluating information. So we only have a few minutes left. I think this has been a great conversation. I hope it's been courageous enough. Again, I think we all wish Salman Rushdie a speedy recovery. And I want to see if Nadine Farid Johnson from Penn has any closing comments or closing thoughts, or wants to circle back to an earlier part of the conversation, perhaps.
Yes, great, thank you. Actually, I did want to make one comment. In the first question, there was a reference to Shireen Abu Akleh, the Palestinian American journalist who was murdered while reporting. And I just wanted to point out that PEN America has called for a thorough, credible investigation in the circumstances of that. And as a US citizen, Ms. Abu Akleh should be afforded the full protection of rights to any American abroad. Just wanted to make sure that I made that point, because it is an important one. I think more broadly, I want to thank you again, Carl and Ambassador and AU, for hosting this discussion. It's been such an honor. The ambassador invoked history, as I mentioned earlier, and we've seen it across history around the world. Where free expression is infringed for some, it will soon be infringed for others. None of us is safe from this deluge. And without freedom of expression, you note this question about what should be protected in people not having an understanding of the role of this right. Without freedom of expression, there is no fight for social justice progress, no protest, no social movement, no progress. None of that is possible without freedom of expression. So we really must protect the freedom to speak and to think and to write for everyone. And as for Mr. Rushdie, we are, of course, hoping and watching that with some worry, of course, and trepidation about his recovery, but we do hope he recovers soon. And I am sure he'll be back on that stage, back in the conversations, and he would not want us to flinch in the face of this threat either. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. And check out Nadine Johnson's work at pen.org. Any closing comments, Ambassador Ahmed?
Carl, just to thank you for taking this initiative, and hope you recover from this traumatic experience. Delighted to be with Nadine, and would like to thank the wonderful AU team that's supporting us. I do want to end with this famous quote. Again, it's coming from a Muslim, where Muslim books have been burnt centuries ago. Where you burn books today, you burn human beings tomorrow. So we should all be very aware of the historical context of supporting books, writers, free-thinking journalists and novelists. And I would like to end with one word, and that is, and it's coming from all the great faiths that we share, and that is compassion. I think we need to show much more compassion on both sides to spread understanding, to spread knowledge, and to build bridges on the basis of compassion, compassion, compassion. So we embrace the whole world.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful note to close on. And thank you for joining us today for this dialogue on Salman Rushdie and the right to write.